All right, come on. There we go. So, our goal for today is to really look at recovery from addiction, looking at it from a relapse prevention perspective. And as part of this journey, what we want to go through is looking at some of the traditional, especially group modalities that have been used. And we'll conclude with one of the more what they call evidence-based type of relapse prevention that we have. Okay. So in this journey, let's start with kind of the landscape of traditional treatment. But let's define what we mean by relapse prevention, recovery, those kinds of things when we're looking at it from an addiction perspective. Okay. Is when people recognize that they have an addictive problem, whether it be drinking, we can include things like gambling, gaming, and even sexual types of addictions. They usually come, if they're not forced to, they usually come with one of two intentions. One is to completely abstain from their addiction, so meaning stop drinking, stop drug use, stop gambling, or they come into treatment wanting to be able to control their addiction, meaning they're not quite to the point where they want to give up uh, their drug of choice. So it might be for example, an alcoholic who wants to reduce from heavy drinking every night to moderate drinking once or twice a week. Okay. And from a recovery perspective, um, an important point to make is, again, in the beginning, if you remember when we talked about this at the beginning of the semester, is that making sure you take the client for who they are and where they're at is more important than saying, you know what, I know you just want to reduce your drinking, but you really should consider abstinence because you know you can't just have one drink. Okay. That's really taking over the client's narrative and is going to build walls between you and the person who is seeking recovery. Okay. So I just want to bring that up um, as when people seek recovery services or therapy services, it usually comes with one of those and two intents. Now, we do have a large population, especially dealing with alcohol and drug addiction, that are there because they're forced to be there. Okay, so if you think the most kind of common one is in order to get DUI charges reduced or to get your children, someone get their children back because of drugs and alcohol, the court requires them to complete, drug and alcohol treatment. Okay. Um, we also have some people who are economically forced into treatment. So you can think of maybe wealthier populations where mom and dad say, you go get treatment or we're going to cut you off. No choice. And so remembering that that is also another large category of individuals who are in treatment. And it's important to say they're in treatment because they probably necessarily wouldn't have sought treatment if an external entity didn't come in and force them. And this is where we get the stereotype that most addicts don't want to change. Okay. And in that context, um, we need it's important to note that actually most people actually do want to change their addictive process. But you will have in any group setting a few that are there because they have to be there, that are going to say they don't have an addiction problem, they don't have this or that. It's the damn court that's making me be here. It's my family, those kinds of things. Those are not really the majority, but they are the hardest to work with. Okay. When we look at the treatment landscape, we can look at kind of three models that tend to exist as kind of continued um, uh, things within the community and within the treatment landscape. The first one is the 12-step program. Okay. 12 steps was developed, I believe it was in the 1940s, 50s, maybe a little earlier than that. Um, and it was based mainly because of people's fear that the end of prohibition would cause a lot of addiction. And remember, prohibition was done based on a moral reasoning, not a public health reason. Okay. And so they felt, okay, addiction has to do with falling from grace, losing your spiritual base, those kinds of things. So the 12-step program was made to allow people to let go of their addiction and um, and give themselves up to a higher spiritual group person. In this case, it's a very Christian based system, and so this then allows the person to um, let go of their addiction for God in a basic sense. It should be noted, and this is something that isn't commonly talked about anymore because of the diversification of 12 steps that we see in contemporary time, is that the original 12 steps was originally normed on middle class white males. Okay. And the complete original model was normed on a single homogeneous population. Okay. But since then, there's been models that have been adapted to the prison setting, to women, to different cultural settings. But it should still be noted that the 12-step program is still far less successful for women and for people of a different cultural or spiritual orientation. Even though it's been tried to be adapted to those populations, the 12-step program still mainly is successful for the white middle class males and successful for other male populations as well. And there's still some work it needs to be done to make it as effective for female and minority type populations. So that should be noted about that model. The Minnesota model is the one that is most commonly used today. But its core philosophy is that addiction is a progressive medical disease. Unlike what the 12-step program emphasized as a moral breach, the Minnesota model takes kind of the biopsychosocial perspective that this is a disease that is equal to, for example, diabetes or heart disease or any other progressive disease. Okay. Therefore, within the Minnesota models, the mechanisms of treatment include medically supervised detox, then combined with holistic group therapy and intensive drug education. So in many ways, it's much like if you think about things like diabetes. In diabetes, you get on an initial medication. You can call this the detox. You've got to change your diet. You've got to do things in order for the disease not to progress anymore. And then the holistic group therapy part is continued management of the disease. And in intensive drug education is educating one about diabetes. Okay. But the point that should be made is just like diabetes, it is treatable, but it's not curable. Okay. So the idea that one is an addict and they will always be an addict comes from this progressive medical model. Okay. Therapeutic communities really started from the inpatient setting and individuals that come from a prison setting. And this is where communal living and shared norms are used to help inpatient residential individuals cope with and live soberly. Okay. So when I worked at a women's prison, they had a therapeutic community. And within this setting, the the females lived in a open dorm type of setting, and they were encouraged to do what are called encounters. So when they see another inmate do something that looks like the addictive process, they have what's called a circle at the end of the day, and it's that job. Well, let me back up. So what they do is when they see another person doing something that looks like what addicts do, they'll write it down on a piece of paper and put it in a box. At the end of the day, one of the therapists will come, they will get the box. It will have the person who observed, the person who did the behavior, the therapist reads it, and then the community as a whole comes up with the consequences. This behavior was observed. It's part of an addictive process. Community, what should we do about this? Now that may sound harsh, but the philosophy behind this is that for many, especially young addicts, they don't necessarily see their behaviors as leading them down the road to substance use or drug use, that there's this unconscious processing that addicts go through that initially they may not recognize their behaviors as leading down that relapse road. Okay. And so this is supposed to kind of normalize that feeling, provide safe environment where if I start doing something wrong, someone will be there to catch me and hold me responsible. Okay. The problem is, and this is the biggest issue with therapeutic communities versus traditional inpatient, where these very strict ideas are good, is that in the therapeutic community, they do very well. But then the example of prison therapeutic communities, then they're released into the real world where those people who were holding them responsible are no longer there. So this model has had to have a lot of adjustments. Okay. So if we look at kind of these different ideas from for relapse prevention, what kind, how can we compare these? Okay. Well, we can compare them on two dimensions. Whether we believe the person is responsible for the development of their addictive behavior, And on the second dimension, is the person responsible for changing their behavior? Okay. So the example that a person is responsible and a person is responsible for changing. So yes and yes. That's the example of the moral model. That relapse is a crime or a lack of willpower on the individual. That not only did they not have the willpower not to be an addict, they chose that, but they also are making the decision to, they don't have the willpower to resist it afterwards. Okay. And then if we compare that to, is a person responsible for the development of the behavior versus is the person responsible for changing the behavior? Okay. If we feel that they're not responsible for the development, so no, but they are responsible for changing, this is the disease model. Okay. They're not responsible because of the way that drug interacts with the person's physiology or their genetics, that they're genetically predisposed to being an addict. Okay. And so in this model, relapse is a reactivation of the progressive disease that is biologically inherent in the individual. So again, I keep using the example of diabetes. So here we have a physical disease, but the person can take medications and they can change their eating habits and um, um, uh, treat the disease, not necessarily cure it. And this is the same with addiction. So a person is an addict because of their genetics and their physiology, but they can change things in their environment to manage or treat that disease. Okay. What if a person is responsible for the development of the behavior, but is not responsible for changing the behavior? Okay. This is the spiritual model. This is the example of the 12 steps program. Okay. Where a relapse is a sin or a loss of contact with a higher power. So a relapse represents a person's choice not to change their behavior, but they're not necessarily, let me back that up. They're responsible for the development of that, but it's a responsibility, and to kind of put it in 12 steps thing, it's the responsibility to give oneself up to the higher power, because once you give yourself up to the higher power, God will make sure you stay sober or non-addictive. By giving yourself to God, then that will make it so the disease or the addiction does not continue. Okay. So you're not necessarily responsible as long as you give yourself to God. Okay. Now, is a responsible for the development of the disorder? No. Is a person responsible for changing the behavior? No. Okay, this is what we call a compensatory model. This is what we call the cognitive behavioral model. Okay, relapse, meaning in this model, relapse is a mistake, an error, or a temporary setback. That the person, because it's if we define it as a disease, was not responsible for developing the disease, and if the person changing um, doesn't have the tools or the resources or the ability to change, they're not necessarily responsible for changing that behavior if they don't have the right skill set. Okay. And so you'll notice that this is green highlighted because the compensatory model forms the bedrock of the cognitive behavioral relapse prevention by really removing the moral blame while demanding personal accountability for change, meaning it was a mistake, but you don't have to continue making that mistake. How can we prevent that in the future? Okay. So, let's just talk about the weight of addiction and addictive behavior. I'm hoping this is a review from your introduction to your if you're in if you're doing this certificate, the three core classes for the addiction certificate. I'm hoping this is a review, but we tend to take the biopsychosocial model. So I'll go over this quickly. Is that really addiction has to do with our biological terrain. So this is our genetics and our heritability. It has to do with neurochemical interactions. So the example here is methamphetamine produces 5 times the natural dopamine peak. Okay, and if you want to really understand this, and if you have kids around, plug their ears. But the highest amount of dopamine an individual can produce in a given event is when a human is having a sexual orgasm. That's the most dopamine will produce naturally. Okay. So you take the sensation of an orgasm and multiply it by 5. That is methamphetamine. And so if you want to understand why it's so addictive, and why a lot of people say the first hit you're addicted, imagine it puts your dopamine system, your reward system on complete overdrive. Okay. And so when we talk about neurochemistry, we're talking about what that addictive substance does to the biological neurochemical system. And then what then is the role of the biological system in developing these addictive behaviors? So you'll hear a lot when you're dealing with addiction, a person who really doesn't want to relapse, they really don't want to, and they say they're constantly fighting with their brain. Okay. And if you want to think about that, is literally they are fighting with their physical brain because the brain is saying, let's relapse, let's relapse, let's relapse. I like that stuff. I like that stuff. Remember, your brain is amoral. It doesn't base anything on morality. It bases everything on the input it's receiving. Okay. And if a substance gave it what it needed at a time, it's going to say, let's do more of that. Okay. So you'll often hear in addiction recovery, the person in recovery talking about they fight with their brain on a daily basis. Now you can put it in your mind that they are actually fighting with a physical brain that needs physical things. Okay. And then we talk in the biological terrain about tolerance and withdrawal. So tolerance is you need more and more and more because your body sensates to current stuff, and then withdraw cycles. Okay. I know, someone, an addict, and I think it'll be famous someday. They had this concept of the recovery fifth. Okay. And this is an example of the withdrawal cycle. So the person would drink in the one day, wake up and feel so horrible, the shakes, the withdrawals, all of those things. And the brain kind of goes, you know how we can get rid of this. And so the next morning they went and got what they called their recovery fifth so they could function through their day, go to work, get things done without shaking and having the withdrawal symptoms. Okay. And that's a very common addictive process. All right. And then we need to talk about the psychological mechanisms. Okay. And many that deal with addiction is expectancies of positive drug outcomes. Okay. And I've mentioned this in this class before. When individuals start to glorify their trauma, you know that they're heading for a relapse. So within the addiction field, when group members starts talking about the good old days and how it made them feel good, all of those things, that should be a red flag in your head going, uh-oh, we need to start talking about a relapse plan. Because once the glorification starts, that's the road to relapse. And then we talk about poor coping and stress management deficits. And then also with addiction, because of its immediacy effect, addicts tend to become very impulsive and sensation seekers. And I do want to just note on this that there's no evidence that a person who has a naturally impulsive personality, that person that is naturally sensation seeking, is more likely to become an addict than people who are not impulsive and sensation seeking. Impulsive and sensation seeking become a symptom and part of the disease of addiction. Okay. So that's something to keep in mind. This isn't necessarily a default in a person's personality. This is something that the addictive process has created. The other aspect is the socio-cultural environment. So we have family history, such as abuse, neglect, use, peer influence, and addiction culture, and media glorification of immediate gratification, or those movies where you'd think by the end of the movie they would be sloshy drunk because they drank through the whole thing. Those kinds of things about the falsehood of being able to manage large amounts of alcohol. Okay. And so these are all the factors that really go into the addictive behaviors that we want to really look at when we're looking at relapse prevention. Okay. So this kind of gives the landscape. We have those three things going on, and we're on abstinence road. So we decided this is enough. So we went through detox. We've gone through intensive treatment. We're still involved in groups, those kinds of things. So we're on abstinence road. But then comes what are known as urge junctions. Okay. This is a point where a person has a strong urge to drink or use their drug of choice. They've been triggered by multiple triggers. And so they come to this junction, and this is why it's called a hazard zone in the yellow. Is at this point, they could use the skills, the coping mechanisms, the support systems, the relapse prevention contract, and resist, which leads to recovery city, or they might lapse. Okay. Now, there's three terms that you will see here: lapse, prolapse, and relapse road. Okay. A lapse is when a person, the most typical one is they kind of test it, right? So they're in a situation, they've been triggered, they have a strong urge to drink, and so they have one or two drinks. This is called a lapse, okay? And at this point, they then have a choice. They can go, you know what, that was a mistake. and I'm going to return to a recovery road. And so they go through what's called a prolapse, where they learn something from that one time and they return back to recovery road, okay, or abstinence road. On the other side, when a lapse, a momentary slight in judgment or action, leads continued work, this is when a person is relapsing, okay? Meaning that one moment of mistakes leads to that spiral into addiction, okay? And the reason why I would encourage you to kind of use this model is that a lot of addicts, and I don't care what world you live in, is going to come to a moment of I I I I'm curious, I'm strong, I'm okay, I want to see, and something may come up easily for them, and they may drink or they may use a drug. Okay. Um, the reason and the difficult part is after they then assume that they're completely back to square one. They really consider it the relapse, that they're back into their disease state, they screwed up, they messed up, all of those self-blaming things. Um, that's going to defining a lapse as a relapse is really going to push them towards their addictive cycle. Because one of the things that we will see in the relapse prevention model is this idea of self-efficacy, which is on this next slide. Okay. And this is a good point. Self-efficacy is one's belief that they can do something. So self-efficacy about passing this class. There's a lot of you that I think probably has a lot of self-efficacy because you're doing awesome. Okay. Self-efficacy about raising children, if we want to look at more on long term, those kinds of things. Uh, when we find that the more self-efficacy someone who's going through addiction decreases the probability of a relapse. Okay. Where decreased self-efficacy tends to lead to more the lapse, the relapse, and all of those that lane. Okay. And this is where it's important not to just take that first moment of instant use as a complete relapse because it decreases the addict's self-efficacy. That here I am, I'm screwed up, I'm back to square one. I don't think I can do this. I can't manage my own symptoms, and that's going to lead to use. And the important thing to understand as a counselor and as a professional, this can happen on a conscious level where the person rationalizes that they can't control their drinking, or it can occur on an unconscious level that then drives their behaviors and their behaviors towards addiction. Okay. So the idea behind cognitive behavioral therapy is really to build that self-efficacy, that the patient can exert control over their own situation, that they're the ones in the driver's seat, not their drug, not their brain, not their biochemistry or their genetics. They're the ones that are driving the truck or the car. Okay. And so when we look at this, again, looking at it from a different perspective, a lapse is rarely an immediate return to baseline addiction. It is a progressive cascade that accelerates as cognitive guardrails start to fail. Okay. So when we look at someone who has gone through detox, okay, and this is when a person is discharged from the hospital, they'll go through and have a time of sobriety. Okay. And they will have their first drink. This is the lapse. Okay. That lapse initially goes, I can control this. And so they have a second drink, and then a third drink, and then they end up drinking until intoxication. Okay. And then within that, uh, we then have more progressive drinking, where it then goes back into the addictive process where it becomes daily, it becomes all the time. This chart here is an example of college students. Believe it or not, at the end of a freshman college year, there's a lot of freshmen with drinking problems. If you can imagine why. It's their first freedom. They're usually old enough to drink. They are not within family, which tend to be those boundaries. And so a lot of freshmen leave their freshman years with addiction and they end up going into some type of hospitalization. And this is kind of the process that we've noticed following these students is that they do that first drink, the second drink, the intoxication. And then when they're back into school, they'll drink socially whenever they can. Then school starts. And by the end of the semester, they're drinking again on a daily basis. Okay. And this also is representative of what we see when a person doesn't come out of that first lapse with a little bit of efficacy and a little bit more skill and learned lessons. And there's something called the AVE, which is what's known as the abstinence violation effects. And this is when a lapse, initial substance abuse, leads to an emotional reaction, intense guilt, blame, comparison to internalized standards. And this leads to our cognitive appraisal that I'm uncontrollable, internalized failure. And so our behavioral reaction to resolve these cognitive discrepancy is to surrender to the habit. Okay. The insight is that the true danger and solely the pharmacological effects of the first drink, but the devastating psychological weight of perceived failure. Okay. And we call this the abstinence violation effect. So, let's see, where are we at? So what I propose is that we stop here now that we've talked about these processes